I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the face that bore a striking resemblance to her, the one Alexander Grant called his perfect memory. She was his everything, the woman he could never forget. And now, I was her replacement. 3 months ago, I was drowning in hospital bills, desperate to save my mother. Then, Alexander's assistant appeared with an offer I couldn't refuse. Play the role of his lost love, and he'd pay me enough to change my life. Remember your place, Alexander said, his voice cold as ice. He stepped closer, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. You're just a stand-in. I nodded, trembling as I slipped into the white dress he handed me. It was her favorite color, he said. His fingers brushed through my hair, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. But then, without warning, he pinned me against the wall, his lips crashing onto mine. The kiss was fierce, almost angry, as if he were trying to erase her memory by replacing it with me. Mr. Grant, I tried to pull away. Don't, he growled. You took the money. Now, you'll do as I say. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander's demands grew more intense. He wanted me to mimic her every move, the way she smiled, the way she spoke, even the way she tilted her head. If I failed, he'd punish me, his cold demeanor turning icy and distant. Then, one day, I found a photo in his study. The woman in the picture looked almost like me, but there was something different, a small beauty mark near her eye, a detail I didn't have. On the back of the photo, Alexander had written, "To my beloved sister, may you find peace in heaven." My hands shook as I realized the truth. The woman he called his perfect memory wasn't a lover, she was his sister. I stood in Alexander's study, clutching the photograph tightly, my thoughts in turmoil. The handwriting on the back of the photo made me realize that things were far more complicated than I had imagined. Why did he choose me? Why did he so easily agree to pay for my mother's medical expenses? These questions pierced my heart like a thorn. I decided to start with the medical bills to find some clues. The next day, I excused myself to visit my mother at the hospital, leaving Alexander's mansion. At the hospital, I spoke to my mother's attending physician, hoping to learn more about her condition. "Miss Lin, your mother's condition is indeed complex." The doctor adjusted his glasses, his tone hesitant. "But there's one thing that has always struck me as odd." "What is it?" I asked urgently. "Your mother's medical expenses were actually prepaid 3 months ago," the doctor said in a low voice, "and the amount prepaid far exceeded what was actually needed." My heart sank. 3 months ago, that was exactly when Alexander had found me. Had he planned all of this from the beginning? Who made the prepayment? I pressed. The doctor shook his head. "It was paid through an anonymous account. We don't know who it was." Leaving the hospital, my mood grew even heavier. This was clearly no coincidence. What was Alexander's real purpose? Why had he been so generous toward my mother? Back at the mansion, I decided to confront Alexander directly. I knocked on the door to his study. He was sitting at his desk, a glass of red wine in his hand, his gaze cold and detached. "What is it?" he asked, looking up. "I want to know why you paid for my mother's medical expenses," I said, staring straight into his eyes, trying to find answers in his expression. Alexander's eyes flickered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're mine. Naturally, I take care of what's yours." "No, this isn't just about taking care of me," I pressed further. "You knew about my mother's condition long before, even prepaying the medical bills before she was diagnosed. What are you hiding?" His face darkened, and the glass in his hand creaked under his grip. "There are some things you'd need to know." Need asterisk to know. I raised my voice. "I don't want to be a clueless stand-in anymore. Tell me, how did your sister die? Why did you choose me?" A flash of pain crossed Alexander's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by anger. He stood up abruptly, grabbing my wrist with a force that made it hard to breathe. "Enough." His voice was low and dangerous. "You're just a stand-in. You have no right to ask these questions." I clenched my teeth, tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't back down. "If you won't tell me the truth, I'll find out myself." No matter what, I will get answers. Alexander stared at me for a long moment before suddenly releasing my wrist and turning his back to me, his voice hoarse. You have no idea what you're asking for. Some truths are too much for you to bear. I stood there, watching his rigid back, a sense of unease creeping into my heart. Perhaps the truth was far darker than I had imagined. 醒醒 Alexander as pain. 醒醒. The tension in the room was palpable as Alexander turned away from me, his broad shoulders stiff with unspoken emotion. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the antique clock on his desk. I could see the weight of his pain in the way he clenched his fists, the way his breathing seemed uneven, as if he were holding back something too heavy to bear. Alexander, I said softly, my voice trembling. I know you're hurting, but keeping it all inside won't help. Whatever happened to your sister, it's not your fault. He let out a bitter laugh, low and hollow. You think you know anything about fault? He said, his voice like ice. You think you can just walk in here and fix everything with a few words? I stepped closer, my heart pounding. I don't think I can fix anything, but I want to understand. I want to help you. He turned to face me then, his eyes dark and stormy. Help me, he repeated, his tone mocking. You're just a replacement, Emily. A shadow of someone I lost. You can't help me. No one can. His words stung, but I refused to back down. Then tell me why, I said, my voice firmer now. Why did you choose me? Why do you keep pushing me to be like her if it only makes the pain worse? For a moment, he looked as if he might snap, his jaw tightening as he glared at me. But then, something in his expression shifted. The anger faded, replaced by something far more vulnerable, something raw and broken. Because I can't let her go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every time I look at you, I see her. And for a moment, just a moment, it feels like she's still here. His admission hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I could see the torment in his eyes, the way his pain had consumed him for years. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt, a guilt so deep it had twisted him into someone cold and unyielding. What happened to her, Alexander? I asked gently, afraid to push too hard, but desperate to understand. He looked away, his gaze falling on the photograph I had found earlier. It was my fault, he said, his voice hollow. I was supposed to protect her, but I failed, and now she's gone. I reached out, tentatively placing a hand on his arm. He flinched but didn't pull away. You can't keep blaming yourself, I said. Whatever happened, it wasn't your fault. You have to let go of the past. He shook his head, his eyes closing as if to shut out the memories. You don't understand, he said. I don't deserve to let go. Not after what I did. I wanted to ask more, to push him to tell me everything, but I could see the walls closing in around him. His pain was a fortress, one he had built brick by brick over the years. Breaking through it would take time. I wasn't sure I had, Alexander, I said softly. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Let me in, let me help you. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. But for the first time, I had seen a glimpse of the man behind the mask, a man drowning in guilt and regret. And I knew, no matter how hard he pushed me away, I couldn't give up on him. As I stood in Alexander's study, watching him retreat into the shadows of his guilt, I realized something profound. My role in his life was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. I wasn't just a stand-in for his sister, I was a mirror, reflecting back the pain and regret he had buried for years. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, I was also his chance at redemption. Over the next few days, I began to see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The way his cold demeanor would falter when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his eyes would linger on me, not with the intensity of a man obsessed with a replacement, but with the desperation of someone clinging to the hope of forgiveness. One evening, after another tense dinner where he barely spoke, I decided to confront him again. This time, I wasn't going to let him shut me out. Alexander, I said, standing in the doorway of his study. He was snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Afraid? Of what? Of facing the truth, I said, my voice steady, despite the pounding of my heart. You've spent years punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. But you can't keep running from it, and you can't keep using me as a way to avoid dealing with your pain. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he set his glass down and leaned back in his chair. You think you have it all figured out, don't you? No, I admitted, but I know that whatever happened to your sister, it's eating you alive. And I know that if you don't confront it, it's going to destroy you.